Hello, hello, welcome to the show. Welcome to Not Just Nintendo, a video game podcast that is about Nintendo. But it's not just Nintendo, because here we talk about all video game companies. And by we, I mean just me, because I am solo on this endeavor. This is now episode 4, week 4 of doing this. We've been going for almost a month here, which is pretty cool, I suppose. We're almost to that episode 5, I don't know if that's not really that significant, to be honest, but I guess it's a nice little marker to have, right? Obviously 10 is going to be a little bit bigger a deal, and then we won't have a big thing until like 50 probably is kind of the big thing. Because 50 is almost a year, and it's also, it's a decent number, right? So we've got a long ways till then, but, we're a tenth of the way there almost, right? So that's kind of big news, I suppose. Anyways, hello everybody. Hello, hello. How is it going today? So for today's episode, I have beaten 2 games, unlike last time. Last time I had just that. I basically just talked about some Switch 2 games that I wanted to see coming to Switch 2. Oh, wow, I know. Switch 2 games I wanted to see coming to Switch 2. Some games I wanted to see coming to Switch 2. Of course, we have the Switch 2 presentation in, 21 days when you're seeing this. For me, it's still 23. And also, I'm recording this on Mario Day, so happy belated Mario Day, everybody. I hope you all had a fantastic Mario Day. I'm trying to think, did I play anything Mario today? No, I didn't. Yeah, I didn't play any Mario stuff today. Well, that's okay. I think I did last year. Trying to remember, I actually have, what I beat. I almost think I beat Donkey Kong Country on Mario Day. Yes, I did. I beat Super Mario World on the 9th, Super Mario Land 2 on the 11th, but then I beat Donkey Kong Country on the 10th. That's kind of funny. Um, wow, it's kind of cool to have the list of all the stuff. I mean, I've got exact hours on everything I've beaten since January 2024. That's well over a year now, so that's kind of cool. Anyways, I'm crazy like that. And speaking of things I've beaten, like I said, I had 2 games that I beat since last time, unlike last time. Last time I didn't have anything, because I was a slacker by not slacking off enough, I suppose. So that's pretty cool, and we'll talk about those 2 games. One of them I have quite a bit to say, and then the other one I don't really have so much to say. But I'll mention it, it's worth a mention. It was a good game. And that will be that. And then, for the rest of the show, which is probably going to be the majority of the show, I'm actually thinking this one might go a little longer today. I'm not sure yet. I'm still figuring that out. I'm recording this a little later than normally. Usually I record on Sunday night, and it's Monday night, and also later than I would have liked to have started. So I'm not going to be able to do it all today. I'll probably have to finish it up tomorrow. So you don't need to know that, but I decided to tell you anyway because I don't know. I don't know why. I don't know why. Um, Unfortunately, we don't have any emails to answer today because nobody emailed me. You've got to email me to get emails read. That's how that works. So if you'd like to email the show with questions or comments, or I don't know, if you want to argue with my hot takes, you can go to notjustnintendo@gmail.com and email. That is NOTJUSTNINTENDO, all one word, at gmail.com. And you also, if you're on YouTube, which I think is the vast majority of people, you can just comment on YouTube. I'll see comments. And if you're on Spotify, you can also comment on there. I'm not really sure why you would, but if you'd like, you can also comment there. I will see those as well. I don't check them every day like I do with the YouTube comments, but I check them, before the episode, so it doesn't really matter. So that's that. Alright, so let's talk about the 2 games that I played, and then we'll jump into did I actually say? I don't think I said right. I don't think I said what the other segment of the show was going to be. I'm a mess today. I'm a mess every day. You guys know that, but I'm a mess, especially today. I took a pen, I took some paper, and I made another list. This time, not of games that I want to see coming to Switch 2, but instead of games I want to see coming to Switch 2. It's the Virtual Console. Specifically NSO, I should say. It's not a Virtual Console anymore. It's not how that works, but it's Nintendo Switch Online. I made an entire, well, actually a few different papers worth of lists, and I'm going to be talking about all those games. I mean, some of them might just get a mention. Others might actually, I might talk about a little bit, but, there's some cool things, and that'll be fun, and that'll be most of the show. I think I said that this show might go a little longer. We'll see. I might have just said twice that I'm doing NSO stuff. I don't know. If I am, I'm a mess. I'm sorry. Uh, I'm a disaster, alright? Alright, so let's talk about these two games. So, the first game that I beat since last show, and I didn't mention it on last show, I mentioned that I was playing it. And I think I was maybe a little bit more negative on it then than I am now. But I was still saying it was decent then, I just wasn't liking it as much. And that game is Super Metroid. So, Super Metroid, you know, I started that before I recorded the last show, like a couple days before. And I started Super Metroid, and I was like, yeah. So if you're not someone who's listened to the last few episodes, or really the only few episodes of this podcast, my history with Metroid is tried, other than like a little bit on NSO every now and then, I tried Super Metroid for the first time seriously, probably back in, maybe May or June of 2024. I tried Super Metroid, and I really didn't like it. I never knew what to do. I was constantly stuck. It was honestly infuriating. Infuriating? Infuriating. It was honestly infuriating. 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 I don't know. I just said that word like 5 times. Infuriating. Infuriating. I don't know why I said infuriating. I like added an extra syllable there. Anyways, doesn't matter. It was infuriating. And it is infuriating. What is wrong with me? I don't know. Anyways, it was very frustrating, we'll say. And I was very frustrated playing Super Metroid. Everybody talked about how fluid the controls were, and I was like, this doesn't feel all that fluid. It feels okay, I guess. There were one-way doors everywhere. I would go through a one-way door, and then I'd not know how to get back. And I'm like, am I soft-locked? And I was like, surely I'm not soft-locked. Surely I just went here at the wrong time, and I need an ability to progress, but I don't know where the random hole in the floor is to bomb to get out, and it's a whole mess, you know, and that was constantly what I was feeling, is that you had to just bomb a random wall, bomb a floor. It's not quite as bad as I made it out. And I should say, I tried this in May or June of 2024. Then I tried again in August of 2024. Then I tried again in October of 2024. Or maybe it was November, I don't know. But I tried 3 times last year, and every time I came to the same, few obstacles. And, I would play for like 15 minutes, and then I would get stuck for like an hour. It was ridiculous, absolutely insane. So I wasn't really a fan of all of that. And so, and I'd look up a guide, and I'd literally be trying to sift through a guide for hours because nobody did things in the same order, and I just absolutely just cannot figure out how to get unstuck like 90% of the time. And so I put down Super Metroid like 3 different times. Every time I was like, I'm never going to come back to this game. But I felt obligated. I felt obligated to play Metroid because everybody loves Metroid. It's one of Nintendo's biggest, well, I mean, it's not that big, but it is still one of their biggest series. And everybody loves it. It's critically is reviewed so well. There's a whole genre of games that I can't play if I don't like Metroid. Like it's a whole thing. I was like, I had to like Metroid. And I just didn't like Metroid. So, a few weeks back, I came to a realization. And I was like, you know what? Maybe I do like Metroid. But maybe Super Metroid isn't for me. Or maybe Super Metroid isn't the game to get me into Metroid. And so I tried Metroid Zero Mission. And I talked about Metroid Zero Mission to some semblance of length. A couple episodes ago, I want to say it was episode 2. Yeah, episode 2, I think. I talked about Metroid Zero Mission episode 2, and I think I talked about Fusion there too. Because I played Zero Mission over like 2 or 3 days, and then I played Fusion in like, I started like in the evening, and then I put it down at night, and I came back and beat it the next like afternoon. So I just blitzed through Fusion like it was nothing. And so then it's been, and I did both of those over a school break. I didn't have school over the break, and so that's why I could play so much of it. But I was very hooked by both of those games. And then I went and played Super Metroid just I finished it a few days ago. And I've got to say, Super Metroid, it's pretty darn good. It's pretty darn good. I understand now what the buzz is about, and it's 4th time's a charm, you know what they say, right? And I was right. Super Metroid was just not the thing to get me into Metroid. And honestly, I would not recommend Super Metroid as a first Metroid game to anybody. I would say you've got to start probably with Zero Mission or with Dread because it's the newest. I could understand if you started with Dread, although I don't know because I haven't played Dread. I need to play Dread, so maybe Dread's not the best. But I think Dread is also probably an acceptable starting point. Um, I think you should start with the 2D ones because I should say I've started Metroid Prime. I'm a little stuck on Metroid Prime to be honest, but I'm gonna go back to it. And Metroid Prime, it was like a crazy realization when I started Metroid Prime, and I was like, there were some enemies that were like, I'm trying to think, like, there's those bats, right? There are those bats, and they're in every Metroid game, or at least every one I've played. There's still a lot of Metroid I need to play, but there's these bats, and they go like they bounce off the walls, and they go up and down, and they swoop, right? And they're in every Metroid game. In Metroid Prime, they show up, and they do the same pattern where they go up and down, but they also go in a circle. And it's like such a basic thing, but it was like such a crazy realization to me. I was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what they do in the 2D games. And now I've got this newfound like appreciation, like, oh my gosh, you know, going through a tight corridor. That's the same feeling that Samus gets when she's, in the 2D space. But now you almost experience it a little better. It's almost like VR, right? And if there ever were VR Nintendo games, Metroid Prime would absolutely be the first thing everybody would want in VR, and I could understand why. And it sounds really stupid for me. I'm like, obviously, like a 3D game, 2D game, right? It's nothing crazy. But it is pretty crazy playing a couple 2D games and then moving into a 3D game that's also good, right? Because then you kind of get like, oh my gosh, it's such a development, Especially when you aren't super familiar. And it almost makes me think this must be what it was like when Super Mario 64 came out. For anybody who had played Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, and 3. Oh, and in World. And then Super Mario 64 came out, and it was shocking, mind-blowing. I had not quite as bad, but a little bit of that with Metroid Prime, and I've got to say, it's great. But I'm still working on Metroid Prime. It's not something I'll probably talk about next week. I'm probably going to take my time with it, and, but who knows, honestly. Hard to say. I might not. We'll see. So yes, Metroid Prime, one of the things I'm playing now. Let's get back to Super Metroid, though. Super Metroid, as far as the controls and the fluidity, a lot of people talk that, it's quite fluid, it feels quite nice to control. It's fine. It's acceptable. I don't think it's anything extraordinary. I mean, honestly, I think Fusion and Zero Mission both feel tighter, and both feel better to control. If I'm being honest with you, nothing really inherently wrong with Super Metroid. Well, okay, the wall jumping's not great. If we're being honest, the wall jumping kind of sucks. Like, it's not. I mean, by the end, I could do it reliably, but it still didn't feel great. And at the beginning, it's so tough to like get that down, and I don't know. Didn't really like it. I didn't really like how the grapple hook worked, and I know that's not a popular opinion. I know I have a lot of hot takes here about Super Metroid. If you want to email the show about how wrong I am, go for it. Um, so I really don't like the grapple hook. There's a lot of things, minor things, I really just didn't feel. I will say I really did like the power up where you can see through walls, so you can kind of see if you have to bomb a random floor or something to get a missile upgrade. I liked that kind of stuff. I think I only had a little bit more than a row of energy tanks by the end, because of course I had save states, so it wasn't a huge deal. Um, I don't think I really like abused it too much, but I definitely there at the end I made a couple save states in the final few bosses. So probably starting at Ridley. That's not a spoiler that Ridley's a boss in this game, right? I mean that's kind of I mean it's a Metroid game, right? Obviously. Um, I guess I could I guess I could spoil Super Metroid. I don't know. If you don't want spoilers on Super Metroid, go away. I don't think it's going to be too long. I'll put a timestamp in the description. These spoilers are going to be pretty light anyway. I don't have that much to say, but I'll quickly get into it. Alright, so, I've got to say, when you first start playing Super Metroid, and you land on planet Zebes or Zebes. I don't know. Probably Zebes. I don't know. I always say Zebes. I don't know if what's the correct pronunciation there. And you go down. I think you go off to the left, right? And you go down the staircase. You go through like Crateria. You get down to I think it's Brinstar. I think you get to Brinstar. And you get like the morph ball, and you get those first few upgrades where you're just one after another, boom, 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 knocking them out like nothing, right? That's amazing. absolutely fantastic. Like, it's masterfully done. And when I came back the last time, this time, when I was playing Super Metroid, I was like, oh my gosh, like, was I really blind to this before? And I think the upgrades and stuff get a little bit weaker later on. I think the game does get weak in the middle. I think it starts really, really strong, it ends really, really strong, and in the middle, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Overall, probably a top 20 game for me. I don't know. I think all three Metroids there might be in the top 20, which is high praise for sure. But then again, I haven't played that many games in the grand scheme of things. I'm definitely not somebody who's played hundreds and hundreds. I think as far as things I've beaten, I'm probably not even quite at 100 games that I've beaten. So if I wanted to make like a top 100 list of games I've played, I think I'd struggle. I could definitely do a top 50, and I might end up doing a top 50. A top 100, I think I'd struggle a little bit. There'd be some things on there that I don't like too much. So, anyways, but my point is, Super Metroid, pretty darn good game. There was the Ridley boss fight. I know you're supposed to, or at least I'm pretty sure you're supposed to. I know in Fusion and stuff, you're supposed to fight him using the charge beam, with like the spread shot, whatever that's called. I can't remember. Is it plasma beam? I don't know. Well, you've got three shots like in a row. Um, I think you're supposed to fight him like that. Where you point down with the arm cannon and then you jump up and I guess sometimes you have to jump, sometimes you don't, and you shoot him that way. I tried a little bit of that, but honestly, I was struggling, so I just used missiles. I ran out of missiles, and then the last few hits, I had to do the last few hits like the charge beam. But it was just too hard to charge the beam. And then he would come down, and sometimes you'd have to go in a morph ball and roll away, and then you'd lose your charge, and then turn into bombs, and it was a mess. So I found it easier to do it with missiles. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like every guide I'd look up, because I was struggling. I looked up a guide, and everybody was doing that charge shot thing, and I really just couldn't get that to work. Quite so well. Oh, there was another big thing in Super Metroid, another big moment that was fantastic. Also right there at the beginning. I think it's like right after the escape sequence, the first, like the opening escape sequence. 'Cause there's two in this game. There's two. I think there's two. Yeah, I think there's two. Right after that sequence, you go down and you go in a room, or maybe this is after you get the morph ball. I'm not sure. It's somewhere at the beginning of the game, and you enter the boss fight room from Metroid or Metroid Zero Mission, whichever one, with Mother Brain. Oh my gosh, that was so crazy. I was walking through that room and I literally had to stop in my tracks. I'm like, wait a minute. This is totally the same room. And obviously, afterwards, I was like, oh, duh, obviously it's the same room, right? But I just had that little moment of realization. I was like, oh my gosh, Like, there's almost some world building here. Yeah, wow. I mean, I've got to say, Super Metroid, pretty awesome. I'm going to probably end the spoiler section here because I don't have that much to say. It's one of those things that, maybe one day I'll try to have someone on who's played these games, but, I'm not, I don't know people. It's the problem. I have a couple friends. Most of them don't play a ton of these old Nintendo games and stuff, so I might have somebody on here so soon, but I don't imagine we'll be talking about Metroid because I can't imagine. I don't know anybody who's played Metroid. At least if I do, I don't know that they've played Metroid. It's not something that. It's not the most popular of things. But I think a lot of people know about it and have not played it. So yeah, Super Metroid. I still think Metroid Fusion is my favorite of the three, and I know, that's blasphemy. And honestly, if I finish up Metroid Prime, I'm thinking that might go to the top. I'm kind of mixed. We'll see. I don't know, because there's a lot of great things. I've heard the end of Prime is pretty weak though, so who knows? Maybe I'll bounce off the end and it'll fall down. But just from what I've played of Prime, I'm like, man, this might even be better than all the 2D ones, or at least the 2D ones I've played. But yeah, so for me, Metroid Fusion, Metroid Zero Mission's pretty close, and Super Metroid's pretty close to that. They're all pretty close to the top. And, there could be a day I wake up and I'm like, you know what, maybe Super Metroid is better. And then the next day I'm like, well, maybe it's Zero Mission. And then the next day I'm back to Fusion. But I think generally, at least where I'm feeling right now, I would say probably Fusion is my favorite, followed by Zero Mission, followed by Super Metroid. But Super Metroid, still a fantastic game. I think everybody should play it. And I think but it shouldn't be your first Metroidvania. It shouldn't be your first Metroid game. I think Metroid Zero Mission should probably be your first Metroidvania, and then I think you probably should play all the Metroids before you get into other Metroidvanias. I think, but I'm not the best authority for Metroidvanias because I haven't played very many. I'm looking to, right? I need to play Metroid Dread, and I need to play Metroid Samus Returns. For some reason, every time I'm talking about Zero Mission, I want to say Samus Returns, and every time I'm talking about Samus Returns, I want to look up Zero Mission. I remember in Zero Mission, there was one part when I got lost. Because in Super Metroid, I still got lost a little bit, not too bad. In Zero Mission, I got lost a bit less, and in Fusion, I almost never got lost. Um, I think there was one time I got lost in Fusion, so that's part of why I like Fusion so much. Um, so it was in Metroid Zero Mission. I was trying to find a map, and I looked it up, and I ended up looking up a Metroid Samus Returns map on accident. I thought I had put in Metroid Zero Mission, and I was looking at this map, and I'm like, what the heck? Like, this looks nothing like the map. I'm like, Criteria and Brimstone, they're in the wrong spots. The rooms don't line up. Like, what is going on here? I was confused for a very long time until I noticed in the upper right-hand corner of the map the Metroid Samus Returns logo. I was like, oh shoot, I got the wrong game. It almost reminds me of when I was trying to play when I was playing Breath of the Wild, and I was looking for the last Great Fairy Fountain that I hadn't found. I'm trying to think which one it was that I hadn't found. Um I had the Gerudo Desert one, I had the Kakariko Village one, and I had the Hebrew one, I think. It was the fourth one there. I can't remember where that exactly that one is, because I'm not like a crazy big Breath of the Wild guy. Maybe it's near Eldon, I'm not sure. But anyways, I was looking for that final Great Fairy Fountain, and I looked up Great Fairy Fountain map, because I figured it would probably give me Breath of the Wild and not Ocarina of Time, right? That was the only other thing. And it gave me the Tears of the Kingdom ones. And I like literally was looking around on the map for a long time, like, where are these fairies? It didn't even occur to me that I was looking at the Tears of the Kingdom map and that they were the same map, but the fairy fountains were in the wrong spots, right? So I had that same thing with Samus Returns and Zero Mission, and I thought that was kind of funny. It was not in the moment. In the moment, I was quite upset, but in hindsight, it was quite funny. So yes, I beat Metroid, Super Metroid, I should say. I almost said Metroid Super, which would be a weird alternate reality if it was titled Metroid Super. But yes, I beat Super Metroid on March 7th, so a few days ago. Total of 8 hours. I'm not sure if that's fast or slow for Super Metroid. I don't really know. I guess I could check on how long to beat for Super Metroid. I think for both Fusion and Zero Mission, I was a tad bit slow, but I don't think it was too slow. Um, I don't think I'm very good at Metroidvanias, to be honest with you. Let's see, Super Metroid. They say 7.5. Okay, so I was a little slow, but it wasn't too bad. Okay, that's pretty cool. All right. So the other game that I beat since last week, I'll probably be talking about for less time. I just have less to say about it, to be honest with you. It was a game called Once Upon a Jester. So Once Upon a Jester is a game by, I'm gonna try real hard right here. Bonte Avond. Bonte Avond, I think. Honestly, I think it's Bonte Avond. I don't know. Bonte space Avond. Bonte Avond. I think. Because it's Dutch. I'm not a Dutchman. I don't speak Dutch. So I don't know. Not entirely sure. I think that's how you say that. So if anybody is Dutch, don't shoot me. But if you want to tell me how to pronounce that, go feel free. Feel free to email the show, right? Anyways, so they're these guys. They're musicians, but they're also game designers, which is actually really a neat thing. You know, you don't tend to see a whole lot of that crossed. And I learned that apparently they have like other games as well, which is pretty cool. They made let's see, they have Crash'em and the Dragon of Terzaville, who got his neck broken in a weird accident. And those are both free downloads, very short things, I guess. I'm looking at their website here. They made longer things. They made Tower Guy, Everybody Wham Wham, Once Upon a Jester, and the newest thing, or maybe it's coming. Yeah, I think it's coming. Bonnie Bear Saves Frog Time. So as you can imagine from some of these titles, especially the Dragon of Terzaville, who got his neck broken in a weird accident, you can imagine that these are actually quite goofy, ridiculous games. And they're indie games. This Once Upon a Jester was free on GOG. I think it's pronounced GOG, GOG Galaxy, GOG. I always say GOG. It might be GOG. I don't know. I say GOG Galaxy. That's the launcher by CD Projekt Red, and their whole thing is that they're like DRM free. So you like, in theory, one day if the store shut down, you could actually just take your games and import them to Steam or store them locally instead of having to worry about losing your stuff. Whereas on like Steam, right, if Steam shuts down, there may be some developers who will honor a second version, but most games will just disappear. So that's kind of the benefit to GOG. I don't really use GOG much myself. I only have GOG for the few free things that pop up. Generally, free stuff pops up on Epic more often than not. So I've talked about several games. Well, I say several. I've talked about a couple games on the show. Definitely not several. I've talked about a couple games on the show that have been free on Epic. I played Behind the Frame, The Finest Scenery earlier this year. In February 1st, I beat that game. And then like last year, when I wasn't doing the podcast, but I talked about it in my top 50 games, and I think I've mentioned it. I played like Poem was one that I played free on Epic Games. So there's free stuff on Epic Games all the time, and occasionally there's free stuff on GOG or on Steam. And Once Upon a Jester just so happened to be something that was free on GOG back in I think it was October or November, and I claimed it and I played it just now in March. So I started in March. Yeah, so March. And Once Upon a Jester, it's a music-based thing, as you might have guessed by the two musicians thing that I was talking about. It's like a music-based game, and it's a little indie game. I would say it's maybe point and click. I don't know. It's kind of a weird way of describing it, but it's probably kind of point and click. It's an adventure, narrative-based game. Um, let's see, narrative point and click music game, I would say, but it's not like a rhythm game or anything. Um, and yeah, it's very narrative focused. It's very funny. The dialogue's funny. The voice acting is funny. Um, I guess one of their things is that they often keep in mistakes in both the singing and in the speaking. And you could hear they like slip up or whatever. But that actually kind of works, and then they do that to make it more authentic. And I think that's a neat idea. I've never heard of anybody else doing that, and I think it actually kind of helps a lot with Once Upon a Jester specifically. I haven't played any other games of their other games. Once Upon a Jester, you are a dude named Jester, like literally that's his name, Jester, because he's dressed like a jester, and you're there with your best friend Sock. Salk, I don't know. They say Sulk. Sulk, but they're like Dutch, so I don't know. I say sock because he's S-O-K, sock. I don't know. Anyways, but there's the two of you, and Sock is literally a sock. Like he's a sock. Like literally, that's what he is. And you enter a theater competition where you do on stage like improv acting stuff, like a theater show. And you have to win a competition to perform at the Royal Palace. And so you tour across the kingdom, only to like 3 places, and you get some flower bouquets, and you get enough of those, and you win the competition, and you can go to the royal castle. And you've got really one main competitor along the way. It's very goofy, very silly. There's a lot of weird dialogue, a lot of funny things, and it's very goofy, and it's quite fun. It's a little cheesy, it's a little cheesy. But it's quite a fun game, I really enjoyed it. I don't have any, like, standout moments specifically. It's not something that I would probably recommend to most people, but there might be some people out there, if you're just a really big on indie games, or if you've played some of Bonte, Avon's, or whatever, other games, then obviously you should play this game. Or if it becomes free again, then everybody ought to play it. But, it's not something that I would say go out of your way to go track down. It's on Switch, there's that, so, if you're looking for indies to play on Switch, I guess you can buy it. I'm not gonna stop you, and I'm not gonna like run around and just grab your Switch and just sprint and chuck it in the lake. It's not on my agenda. So if you want to play it, be my guest. I finished Once Upon a Jester on March 9th. 9th, is that right? 9th? Yes, March 9th, which is yesterday for me, in about 3 hours in total. I did not play it all in one sitting, or even in one day. I played it over like a whole week. Like I played a little bit on, I think it was on the Saturday, so on the 1st of March, maybe the 2nd, I don't know. And then I chunked it. I played like in 3 or 4 sessions, and I played the full 3 hours. And yeah, it was a fun little experience. That's really all I have to say about this. There's very little gameplay mechanics. You kind of just walk around and talk to people. and choose options. I guess I can kind of describe it a little better. You go to the towns, and every day there's people in the towns you can talk to. And if you talk to them for every day that you're in that town, there's like fun things that can happen, or they have different dialogue and stuff. Um, but there's also people that you can't talk to that if you kind of hover over, you can see like a little thought bubble about what they're talking about to other people. And then there'll be like some subject, you know. So maybe it'll show a zombie, or it'll show a ghost, or it'll show a spider web, and then you know that they're really into horror. And then your theater show for that day, you get to pick while you're doing the theater show. Like, you know, it'll come up, the option will be I'm looking very, and then the options will be, I don't know, romantic or spooky or adventurous, and then, you know, based on what the people had said that day is what you're supposed to pick. And if you do well enough, then you get all 5 flower bouquets and you can move on to the next city after a few days. um, I think it is actually pre-written sometimes that you have to stay for more than 3 days in some of the cities. Unless I'm just bad at this game, that's possible. I don't, I don't know. But it's an interesting concept, you know, and it definitely gets a little more complicated. Not like a ton more complicated. I definitely wouldn't say it gets complicated, but it gets more complicated by the end, where you've got like maybe one thing that they like and 2 things that they dislike, and you've got to be careful not to do those 2. Um, and there's different types of shows you can do, and based on which show you do are what possible themes that can show up. It's a neat thing. It's a neat game. Um, I would say if you're thinking about it, go like watch a trailer, watch gameplay or something before you buy it. It's a little strange, so you know what you're getting into. You know, if you feel like you're gonna buy it. But it's a fun game. So I guess that's all I have really to say about this. So I will be back after a little bit of music, probably from Super Metroid, because Super Metroid has awesome music. Not as good as Fusion, but still awesome music. And I will be talking about some virtual console games that I would like to, or they're not, I guess they're not virtual console. Some Nintendo Switch Online games that I would like to see on Nintendo Switch Online on Nintendo Switch 2. Alright, so let's get right into it. Now, first, I do want to say that it is implied I want all Nintendo Switch Online games from the consoles that already exist. I want all of those carried over. These are just additional things. So I'm not gonna like write down Super Mario Brothers 3. I want to see Super Mario Brothers 3 because we already have Super Mario Brothers 3, right? Of course, I still want it there, but these are just things that we don't currently have that I'd like to see added. And there might be things that I missed that I didn't think of. If you'd like to email any suggestions you have, again, email the show at notjustnintendo@gmail.com, NOTJUSTNINTENDO, or comment on YouTube or Spotify. You can comment on any NSO suggestions that you have as well. I'd be happy to read them on the show and talk about them myself, and maybe I haven't even heard of the game. Who knows? Alright. So, on NES, I'm probably not going to talk a ton about each of these games, but maybe a little bit here and there. The first game that I put for NES that I want, it's actually 6 games. I want a full series. I want Mega Man 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So we did get the Game Boy series of Mega Man games, and I played the first Game Boy game, Wily's Revenge. Of course, the Game Boy games are different to the NES games to different degrees. I think, like, some of them are quite similar. Like, they have a lot of the same levels and stuff. Others are completely different, and then there's some that are kind of in between. So, they have the Game Boy Mega Mans. Why not have the NES Mega Mans, right? Those are the ones people actually want to play. Of course, the answer as to why not is because they have the Mega Man Legacy Collection, which I need to pick up at some point and play. So this one is very unlikely because of that collection, and I'm sure that's why they haven't been put on the NES NSO, because there's a collection, and Capcom, wants to make their collection money, which I understand. But I think it would be cool if we also had a way to play it on Switch Online. Although there are the remakes on Genesis, there's that collection. But it'd be cool to have the original versions and stuff as well. And those remakes are only for what, like the first 3 games or something, so we'd still need 4, 5, 6. And we might as well have all 6. Of course, the Mega Man's being one of the more famous 2D platformers around, and it's something that I really want to play. I don't have much history with Mega Man personally, but I like to build some history. I like to play the games and stuff. I think that'd be a fun thing to do. And I started Game Boy. The first one, I started the Wily's Revenge, and I hated it. I was like, this game sucks. I beat it, but it was the bottom scoring game for my end of the year ranking last year. And I'm not like a Mega Man hater, but I just didn't like that game. So maybe the NES ones are better. I hope they are. I imagine they probably are. I'm thinking it's just a Game Boy problem. So that was the first thing. The second thing is Bionic Commando. That is a Capcom 2D platformer that came out back on NES. Of course, all of these are on NES. And I don't honestly know a whole lot about Bionic Commando other than the fact that it's supposed to be really good. There's no like, if I remember correctly, this is the one where you don't have any jumping. You just use like a grappling hook off like things you swing on them. And it's a 2D platformer and it's supposed to be really good. So that's why I want that one. That's a Capcom game. Another thing that I don't imagine, I feel like Capcom hasn't really brought over much. There's been a few things here and there, but I don't think they've brought over a ton as far as games to NSO. There's also Adventure Island 1 and 2. I've lumped them together here. Adventure Island was a game by Hudson Soft. These were more like 2D platformers. It's like you're on an island. I mean, that's why it's Adventure Island, right? But there's like palm trees and stuff, and I've heard they're also good 2D platformers. And Hudson Soft is a weird one. Like, there's not a whole lot nowadays that's made by Hudson Soft. Actually, I don't even know. Like, does Hudson Soft still exist? Hudson Soft might not even exist. Yeah, it's defunct completely. I know, they originally made, or not originally, but for a while there, they made the Mario Party games, and I think they were responsible for the Bomberman games under Konami, or at least some of them, but I could be mistaken. But yeah, of course, they were a much bigger deal back in the NES, Super Nintendo days. They actually had quite a bit of stuff back then, and then they kind of lost some relevance. They had Bomberman and they had Mario Party were kind of the two things. And then, of course, Nintendo, they cut the deal with Hudson Soft, and they went over to ND Cube. ND Cube is the developer of Mario Party nowadays. So you had Mario Party 1 through 8 and DS, and I guess Advance as well. Those were all by Hudson Soft. And then Mario Party 9 was the first one that was by ND Cube. And of course, most people agree that the ND Cube ones aren't as good. It is interesting though, Mario Party, everyone says 9 was really bad, 10 was supposedly even worse. I think most people agreed Super Mario Party was still awful. But then Mario Party Superstars was pretty decent. And then Jamboree, I've not heard anything but positive things. So it's interesting that they've kind of come back a little bit with the Mario Party games. It's a little strange, to be honest, but I think that's good. It's nice that those have come back. The next thing here, I put Ninja Gaiden 3. Now, I believe Ninja Gaiden 2 is on there. I know for a fact Ninja Gaiden 1 is on the service. I think Ninja Gaiden 2 is on the service as well. But I'm pretty sure Ninja Gaiden 3 is not on the service. These were Tecmo. They were beat-em-ups. I think they're probably some of the more well-known beat-em-ups back from the NES era. You had like River City Ransom. You had Double Dragon. What's the other one that is really famous and I should totally know? Streets of Rage, right? Is another one. There were a lot. Oh, and then of course they had like TMNT, and then TMNT Shredder's Revenge. There were a lot of those things back in the day. Beat 'em up still exist, but not quite to the same capacity. There was that. Or sorry, not Shredder's Revenge. I meant Turtles in Time. Shredder's Revenge was the new one that they made just like 2021 maybe. Konami, they made another Turtles game based off those old ones. That one was Shredder's Revenge. I actually played a little bit of Shredder's Revenge on Game Pass when I had Game Pass, and personally, I really wasn't feeling it, and so I stopped after just like the first level or two. It just wasn't my thing. I've played almost all of Ninja Gaiden. I played through the whole game. I actually thought it was decently easy until the final boss. I absolutely just could not do the final boss. I didn't really struggle through the rest of the game. Obviously, without save states, I might have, but save stating at the start of levels, I was fine. I didn't even have to like save state during levels. I only had to do it at the start. But then the final boss, man, no matter how many save states I used, no matter if I rewinded, no matter like how many times I tried for a couple hours. I just could not beat that final boss of Ninja Gaiden. So there's a good chance I would never play Ninja Gaiden 3 if they added it, but it's something that I think probably should be there. I think I'd probably try it out and not ever like really get far in it. Same goes for 2. I think 2's on there though. The next ones I've put on here Castlevania 1, 2, and 3. I think 2 was on NES, unless 2 was on Game Boy. No, it was on NES. Yeah, okay. So yeah, 1, 2, 3 Castlevania. 2 was Simon's Quest, right? I don't know what 3 was titled, but I know there was a third one on NES. Of course, Dracula's Curse, right? Okay. Yes. Castlevania, of course, back then they weren't quite. I mean, arguably Metroidvanias. I would say the first one probably doesn't really count. I think by like 3, most people agree that they were maybe a little closer. But I think really like Super Castlevania and then like 4, I think Castlevania 4, or I think it is Super Castlevania 4 as a game. If you can't tell, I'm not a crazy big Castlevania expert, but I definitely want to play some Castlevania games, maybe the DS ones, maybe Symphony of the Night. I have some interest in Castlevania, especially after finding a newfound appreciation for Metroid. I'm suddenly a Metroid fan, so I want to play all the Metroid games, and then I want to go off and play some other Metroidvanias, and I think Castlevania would likely be one of the first ones I'd want to pick up. So Castlevania 1, 2, 3, none of them are here. There is that Castlevania Anniversary Collection on Switch. I don't know how many games it has. I know it has a lot, and it's also like $80. And I don't know, maybe I could grab it at some point, but I don't know. Next on here, I've put the Final Fantasies. Oh, I should say actually, with the Castlevania games, there's no way those are going to come because they're in the collection. These are just things that I want to come. Like Ninja Gaiden, I think that's likely. Not likely, but it's possible. Bionic Commando, maybe. But like the Mega Man games and the Castlevania games, no shot those are coming. I guess Adventure Islands I could see possibly. And then the Final Fantasies, no shot the Final Fantasies are coming. I've put Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest both on here. Of course, I've now played Final Fantasy 1 and 2. I kind of took a little bit of break, went and played a little bit of Final Fantasy Adventure, which isn't a Final Fantasy game, it's a Mana game. And I was partway through that, and I kind of stopped. I'm thinking I'm going to come back and use a guide. It's very archaic. I don't know what to do ever. It's a little annoying, to be honest. But I think it'd be a fun thing to maybe have said I've beaten at some point. And then I can move on to, like, Secret of Mana, which is really why I'm there. As far as Mana is really the one I want to play. But yes, I do intend to play all the other Final Fantasies. And I do mean, well, I was going to say I do mean all the other Final Fantasies. But, like, 11, I think, is the one that's just a MMO and it's only in Japan. And I think, I know for a fact 14 is also an MMO. But that one I might consider playing. 11, I have no interest. But every other Final Fantasy I want to play at some point, including the original version of 7. I want to play the original version of 7, then remake, then rebirth, then whatever the next thing ends up being. I think there's only going to be 3 of them, so the next one's the last one for the Final Fantasy 7 remakes. And then who knows, maybe they'll remake Final Fantasy 9 or something. I know people have talked about that. So I think it would be cool to have the NES versions of the Final Fantasies. Of course, I think we could possibly get Final Fantasy 1. As far as 2 and 3, we didn't get those in the West, but they have every now and then dropped things that we didn't get in the West. They usually don't localize, but I think they have in a few instances. So I think it's possible. Well, it's not possible because Square Enix would never agree to that, but it would be great if they did. And those are all the games that I put in NES. I didn't put very many in NES because there's really just not that many NES games that I want to play. If I'm being completely honest, I've played some. The ones I've played, some of them have been great. And there's a few great NES games out there. But for the most part, I think I've played them all, or most of them. All right, so let's move on to Super Nintendo. I made another list of Super Nintendo games. This one is a little bit longer. It's still not terribly long. I put on here Maximum Carnage. I think it's Spider-Man and Venom or something, or just Spider-Man. I don't know. It's like characters, and then Maximum Carnage. This was a Marvel game back in the day. It's quite famous. It was a red cartridge. There was a gray version and a red version, and I think you tend to see the gray version a little bit more, but the red version is like much cooler. It's red. There's not a ton of like colored Super Nintendo cards, just a couple. But really, that's probably the first one I think of for sure when I think of colored cartridges. It's probably Maximum Carnage, and then of course like Ocarina of Time on 64 was colored. But yeah, and Donkey Kong 64 as well. But yes, Maximum Carnage is one of the first things I think about when I think of a colored cartridge. And I really want to play Maximum Carnage. I know I just said I wasn't that big a fan of beat 'em ups, so maybe I wouldn't like Maximum Carnage, but I want to try it anyway because I'm a Marvel guy, I'm a Spider-Man guy, right? And yeah, Maximum Carnage is supposed to be a really, really good beat 'em up with really good music and stuff. So I definitely want to try that, but I would rather not play it on the Super Nintendo. I also don't have it. If I had it, maybe I'd consider it, but I'm not generally regularly busting out the Super Nintendo. I play Super Nintendo games on Switch for the most part. So this is something that I'd like to come out on SNES is Maximum Carnage. This is a game that's really well known. Who actually made Maximum Carnage? Was that Konami? I don't think so, right? I think that was somebody else. Well, Marvel themselves published it, but did they actually make it? Oh, sorry, no, I'm looking at the comic book. Okay. Acclaim made it. Okay. Yeah, alright, Acclaim. Oh, this was on Genesis, too. I did not realize that made it to Genesis. That's crazy. Okay. Well, anyways, Maximum Carnage, definitely a game I want to see. I've also put on here Super Star Wars. I think I have Super Star Wars on Super Nintendo, but I'd like it to be on the Switch Online service. This is another one that's not very likely. Actually, basically nothing I've said thus far was likely, other than maybe Ninja Gaiden 3. Of course, Maximum Carnage, the Acclaim stuff. I don't even know who has access to all that stuff. It's a bit of a mess, I believe, because Acclaim's, no longer around. I'm sure there's somebody that has all those properties. Okay, some of them were purchased by Liquid Media Group. Oh, Gregarious Games own it now? Okay. Oh, wait, it's been moved around a little bit. Okay, Liquid Media Group. Yeah, Liquid Media Group. So I don't really know who's responsible for all that stuff. I imagine whoever owns those things probably doesn't, put a lot of those things out again. It's kind of sad that Acclaim, all those games are kind of dead, but it is what it is, right? Hopefully some of them will get revived. Super Star Wars, I believe Super Star Wars, yeah, that was just Lucas Arts. Okay. Or I guess it was Lucasfilm Games at that point. Alright, but yeah, so there was Super Star Wars, there was Empire Strikes Back, and there was Return of the Jedi Super Star Wars. All three of those, I believe, were all in a series. I think it'd be cool to have those on there because I'm a Star Wars fan, but of course, I don't think these are likely either because, getting Star Wars games licensed like that, I would imagine if those games ever came out again and were playable again, they would probably be, remastered in some way instead. And I think these are platformers, but I guess they also have some weird Metroidvania stuff, so that's kind of interesting. Other games I want on Super Nintendo are Soul Blazer and Illusion of Gaia. These are pretty popular things. They're kind of top-down RPGs, but I guess they're a little bit more Zelda-like, I've heard, with combat and stuff. That's what people say about Mana too, though, so these are some RPGs that I want to see on Super Nintendo. Of course, Super Nintendo is kind of the RPG machine. When you think about RPGs over time, the big systems for RPGs have been, the Super Nintendo, the original PlayStation was a big one. And then honestly, RPGs, I guess, the Switch has been pretty big for RPGs. And I guess you could say the PS5 has been pretty big for RPGs. RPGs are kind of in a weird resurgence, which is nice. But yeah, it's interesting that the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation were such huge, giants for RPGs. They've got the best ones of all time. Most people agree. Other games on here, I also put on Mega Man X's. I believe were there 8 Mega Man X's, but I don't think they all came out there on Super Nintendo. It might have been just 6 of them that came out on Super Nintendo, the Mega Man X games. So whatever ones came out on Super Nintendo, I like those on Super Nintendo for the Switch Online. For the same reasons that I want the regular games, I want to be able to play the Mega Man games. It'd be cool to play them all. But unfortunately, they're not the most accessible. I mean, I guess actually Mega Man's not too bad. They're in the Legacy Collection and stuff. So I guess I could just buy that and my problem would be solved. There's also Mega Man 7 that came out on Super Nintendo. I guess after the X's, they figured, hey, let's go back to the original series. And it didn't work out so well, so they just went right back to the X's. So they did Mega Man 7 on Super Nintendo. So I'd like to see that as well. Again, these aren't likely because of the collections and things the Capcom does. But of course, you know that none of these are likely. I also put on here for Super Nintendo, I put SimCity. SimCity, obviously everybody knows what SimCity is. You know, it's EA. It's a really kind of the main city builder. Like, you don't think of another city builder before you think of SimCity. I don't really think I'd play this one too much, but I think, you know, SimCity was obviously big on PC, but it was also quite big on Super Nintendo, and I think it'd be kind of neat, like, it was a pretty important thing on Super Nintendo, sort of like they have Harvest Moon on there. You know, if they've got Harvest Moon on there, why not have something like SimCity? You know, those kind of like endless games, almost like, you know, Tetris, right? I guess they're not entirely endless, but there's some endings you could take with them, but they're not, you know, the same like story based or any of that kind of stuff. So I think it'd be cool to have something like SimCity on there, and I'd probably check it out once or twice and never play it again. But I think it'd be an interesting thing to have on there, and I'm sure there are plenty of people that would get into that. The next one is something I actually looked up while doing research for this list. Or I discovered it while looking stuff up, and that was Metal Warriors, which was an action platformer by LucasArts. Of course, LucasArts, they didn't do a whole lot of stuff besides Star Wars, really. You know, the vast majority of LucasArts games have been Star Wars because that's like the entire reason the studio exists or existed. It doesn't anymore. And that was like basically the entire reason the studio existed was to make Star Wars licensed games. But every now and then, for whatever reason, I guess I just felt like it one day. They made a couple non Star Wars games, and one of those was Metal Warriors, which is apparently like a really, really good action platformer on Super Nintendo. And it's not something you can usually find out and about on cart, so it's really something I think would be cool for preservation purposes to put on Switch Online. But again, none of the things I've said thus far have been likely. Next up, we've got Super Castlevania 4. And also Dracula X, Castlevania Dracula X. I think those were the only two on Super Nintendo. If there are any more on Super Nintendo, then I want those on there too. I want all the Castlevanias that are on the Switch Online apps on Switch Online. I copied the Final Fantasies down here as well. You got Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6. Obviously, 4 and 6 were, you know, the only two of the three that came out over here. 5 did not come out over here. But, you know, like I said, these things could be localized if they wanted to. If we ever were to get the Final Fantasies, we would probably just get 1, 2, and 3. You know, the one, not real 1, 2, and 3, but the North American 1, 2, and 3. You know, if you don't know, there were 6 Final Fantasy games back between NES and Super Nintendo. 1, 2, 3 on NES, 4, 5, 6 on Super Nintendo. But in the West, those were all in Japan. In the West, all we got was 1, 4, and 6. And to avoid confusion, and actually, by doing so, they created more confusion. They number them 1, 2, and 3 instead of 1, 4, and 6 because, you know, otherwise we'd be missing entries out over here, right? So nowadays, anybody who grew up with the Final Fantasies, you know, they think of them as 1, 4, and 6. But anybody who's gotten into the Final Fantasies since then, when they've been remade and stuff, thinks of them as, you know, 1 through 6 because that's really what originally they were. So it's a little confusing. But if we ever were to get the Final Fantasies, we would probably get 1, 4, and 6, because those are the ones we would get over here. Not that I think we ever have any shot of getting the Final Fantasies. Of course, there were a couple Dragon Quests on here as well. As far as Dragon Quest, you know, they're remaking the Dragon Quest. They put out Dragon Quest 3 in HD 2D last year, I believe. Was it? Yeah, I think it was last year. And this year they were supposed to be doing 1 and 2. And I find it weird that if they were going to remake both 1 and 2 and 3, why would they ever put 3 out before 1 and 2? Like, that doesn't make much sense to me. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's some, like, good reason, you know, if Dragon Quest fans may know. Who knows? Maybe, I don't know, maybe 3 is some sort of, like, prequel. I don't know about it, but anyways, I want to play the Dragon Quest games as well, so I'm probably going to be picking up the Dragon Quest 1 and 2 when that comes out later this year. I don't know when that's actually supposed to come out this year. I don't know if we know yet. I know it was supposed to be this year. Yeah, still just saying 2025. I would guess it's going to be late in the year then, because Dragon Quest 3 came out in October? Is that correct? Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D remake. November. Sorry, it came out in November. So I guess you would expect it to be coming out around the same time this year. So I'll probably have to wait till the end of the year to grab that, and then maybe I'll grab 3 as well. That'll be cool. Who knows? Maybe that'll come out on Switch too. If that comes out on Switch too, I'll consider buying it there instead of on PS5. We'll see. The only problem I could see arising is I think it'd be nice to have all 3 of those games on one platform. And so I I'd feel weird about having 1 and 2 on Switch 2, but then 3 never came to Switch 2. It'll have only come to PS5. It'd be kind of weird, but it's not the end of the world. And also, there's a good chance that Dragon Quest 3 will come out on Switch 2 pretty early in the life, and they just couldn't because obviously the console didn't exist yet when that game came out. That's possible. So maybe it's a completely pointless, and I'll be able to get them all on Switch 2 or on PS5 or wherever I want them. I also put on here Secret of Mana, another thing that's not realistic because we have Collection of Mana and we have the PS4 remake of Secret of Mana. I don't think anything I've said thus far was really realistic. There is some more realistic stuff later on, but these NES and Super Nintendo things, we have such a good library as it is that as far as things you want, you've got to get a little carried away. I also put on here Chrono Trigger. Of course, I really want Chrono Trigger on Switch Online. I have Chrono Trigger digitally. I don't like buying games digitally, but there's not much choice when it comes to Chrono Trigger because the Super Nintendo version is, like $300, and even the DS version is like $100. So you kind of, I guess you can get it physically, but you're better off at that point for something so expensive to just get it digitally, even though it pains me to buy digital things. So I will play Chrono Trigger at some point, probably this year, digitally on Steam. But it would still be cool to have it on the Switch Online service. And I also put on here Tales of Fantasia. This never came out in the West, or at least it didn't back then. I'm sure it probably has since then. That is the first Tales of game. Or I think it's just Tales of the series. Tales is another series I want to play. I have all these games written out in my RPG list that I made last year. End of last year. Maybe it was actually beginning of this year. I don't know. It's been a while since I made that list. Of course, the other RPG series I want to play is Trails. Tales and Trails, don't get those confused, right? But they remade the first Trails game, Trails in the Sky or something. I think it's Trails in the Sky. They remade that recently, I think, right? Yeah, Trails in the Sky came out recently. Again, they remade it. Or it's coming out this year even. That's cool. Well, anyways, so, a lot of RPGs I want coming to Switch Online on Super Nintendo. Now we'll move on to what I think are more interesting things, because, these libraries we have less games in. I have my Nintendo 64 wish list. So, of course, the Nintendo 64 library, there's a lot less games on the 64 library than there are on the Super Nintendo library and on the NES library. Of course, that's, kind of what you'd expect, right? There were less games on the 64 as it is, and I think there's kind of less important ones because less were made, it took longer to make them. Also, this console didn't do as well, games were longer development cycles because they were in 3D now, there's a lot of reasons for that. And also, the games are newer, there's more of them that they can remake, and they're harder to get working on the Switch Online service. There's a lot of reasons. But anyways, that doesn't mean I don't want games on 64 Switch Online, and I think most of the stuff I put on here is decently reasonable. So we'll start out with Diddy Kong Racing. I was actually a little surprised when I finally bought the Switch 64 Switch Online to see that they didn't have Diddy Kong Racing. They've got some other rare games. They've got the Banjos, they've got Perfect Dark, they've got Jet Force Gemini. I feel like I'm missing something here. They have other rare games, I think. But it's funny because the two, very Nintendo-y rare games aren't there. Like Donkey Kong 64 and Diddy Kong Racing. Those were the two rare games on 64 that were, literally using Nintendo characters. And for some reason, those are the ones that can't come to Switch Online. What the heck? Of course, Conker's Bad Fur Day didn't either. But, it is what it is, right? So, it's a little strange to me that Diddy Kong Racing isn't there. Diddy Kong Racing, it's a racing game, obviously, hence the name, right? It's got a nice little story campaign in there. I guess it's even better than the 60 or than the Mario Kart DS mission mode. So I'd like to play Diddy Kong Racing. A lot of people that have played both say it's better than Mario Kart 64, which is cool because Mario Kart 64 is pretty good. So something better than that surely will be amazing. So I definitely want to play Diddy Kong Racing. I do have it on 64, and I likely will just play it on 64. But if it ends up coming to Switch Online service first, I'll play it there instead. But yes, I probably will play that on 64 here, probably this year or next year. I also put on here Castlevania 64. This one's not very likely. I know everybody absolutely hates Castlevania 64, like it's the worst game ever made. I still want it on the Switch Online server so I can try it myself. And also because I want all the Castlevanias, so I want as many as possible. But, even if the game is bad, I think it'd still be interesting to have on there. Another thing though that I'm sure won't happen because it's a Konami thing. I put Conker's Bad Fur Day on here. It's another rare game that I want on Switch Online. And I actually forgot. I should have put Donkey Kong 64 on here too. Conker's Bad Fur Day. Actually, both of those games are 3D platformers by Rare, sort of collectathon-y. Conker's Bad Fur Day is known for being quite dark and adult in its humor. Um, at least considering, it's using a chipmunk as its mascot. Um, so I'm not sure. I was like, maybe Conquer can't come, but like, they've got Turok on Switch Online. So if they got Turok, they can have Conquer, I would think. So yeah, let's get Conquer's Bad Fur Day there as well. And then I've got two more games on 64 that I want. I put Super Smash Brothers. Super Smash Brothers. There's no reason we can't have these on Switch Online. The only issue that I could see arising is that if they put out, well, there's really two issues. If they put out Super Smash Bros. On 64 and they put it out with the online, could that hurt the sale? I don't think it would hurt the sales of Smash, the next Smash, but like, could it maybe bring people to not play that game as much? I think it could. I'm sure it'll still sell as well, but if they won't have as much engagement. They won't have as much engagement in the online service and stuff. I could see that being an issue. It probably isn't that much of an issue, but I could see why Nintendo might think it's an issue. And then the other problem is that if they put Smash Bros. 64 on the Switch Online service, and then later on they put out the GameCube Switch Online service, everybody's going to want them to put out Melee on the GameCube service. And if they put out Melee on the GameCube service, that one could really hurt the sales of Smash Brothers because everybody wants Melee. So it's kind of hard to say. I think they should probably still do it. I don't think it's as big a deal as I'm letting on, but I see why they could maybe think it was a big deal. And the last game I've put here on Nintendo 64, although I just thought of another one. I want to see Star Wars Rogue Squadron. Rogue Squadron, there was a game on GameCube as well. That was the second one, but the first one was on 64. It's like you pilot a X-wing, and that's the game. It's a Star Wars game. I don't actually know much about it. I haven't played it personally, but I definitely want to. And I also, while I was looking at that game, I was like, you know what? We got to have Shadows of the Empire on there too. I know a little bit more about Shadows of the Empire. You play as a guy, I forgot the guy's name, but he's on the Outrider. He's a Legends character in Star Wars, and during the time of like Episode 5. So both of those Star Wars games on 64 would be great, but again, don't expect them to happen because of the rights and stuff. I would say with Game Boy, I had a little bit more difficulty because Game Boy games tend to kind of suck. I mean, they're not all horrible, but like the average Game Boy game isn't very good if we're being honest with ourselves. There's definitely some standouts. There's some, like Link's Awakening, but honestly, even like Link's Awakening, much better on Switch. There's no reason to play it on the original version. I guess unless you're nostalgic or something. Generally, it's probably just better to play it on Switch. But so Game Boy, I had a little bit more difficulty with. I did put down Balloon Kid. I didn't even know this game existed until I was doing research. It's like a remake, not a remake, like a continuation. What am I saying? A sequel. Like, what's the word? I forgot the word sequel. It's a sequel to Balloon Fight on NES. Which, by the way, Balloon Fight, man, is such a fun game. I mean, I've never played much of it. I think it's level based. Maybe I should go by and actually try to complete that. But the little bit I've played of Balloon Fight is fantastic. And let's talk about Nintendo Land, man. Nintendo Land, absolutely fantastic. And especially the Balloon Fight based minigame is amazing. Like, it's actually so much fun. And I think a modern balloon fight would be so cool. I guess it probably wouldn't do very well, and maybe it'd be a little uninteresting, but I think it could be moderately interesting. Just do kind of like they did with Nintendo Land and on the Wii U, and have something like that. But yeah, there's a Balloon Kid on Game Boy. I actually know very little about this game. I actually know basically nothing about this game, other than that it's a sequel to Balloon Fight. And anything of the sort, I want that on Switch Online. And the same goes for Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters. That is the sequel to Kid Icarus on the NES. We've got Kid Icarus on Switch Online, so why not have Kid Icarus 2 on Switch Online, right? You know what they say? You know what they say? They say, if you've got Kid Icarus, you've got to have Kid Icarus 2. It's like a long 100-year-old saying. Um, so why not have Kid Icarus 2? I probably wouldn't play it, because I don't like Kid Icarus 1, but you might as well have it. Here's actually a funny story. I was looking at game. I was thinking of I'm like, what are the best games on Game Boy? And it's like Donkey Kong 94, right? And so I pulled up on my Switch to see like what games were on it already because I was like pretty sure Donkey Kong 94 wasn't on there, but I just wanted to make sure. And literally, they had just added it like a day earlier when I made this list. They had just added Donkey Kong 94 to the service. So if I had made this podcast last week, I would have been talking about um, Donkey Kong 94 coming to Switch Online, and then it would have happened. I could have predicted Donkey Kong 94, but instead I'm stupid. That's a shame. So I'm glad we got Donkey Kong 94. We don't have to worry about that one anymore. And it is good to know that Nintendo's still focused on putting Switch Online games out. You know, they don't put out a ton, it's a little drip feedy. But as long as we don't reset for the next generation, and on Switch 2 we have all of the games that are already on Switch Online carrying over, the only thing I could see them dropping would be Genesis. If they drop Genesis, I won't be too heartbroken. Um, but if they keep all the Nintendo stuff, at least, hopefully Genesis as well, if they carry that all over, I think that would be great. So as long as we don't do that, I think I'm confident that even if they drip feed Switch Online games, that by the end of the generation we'll have even more than we've got now, and we'll be in a really good spot, and we'll just have so many great games on the service. Here's another game that I didn't know about. I guess I must not be very knowledgeable on Game Boy games. It is Wario Blast, which is actually like a Bomberman game that was like guest starring Wario, which sounds awesome, and that's why I want it on the service. Of course, the problem with this one is that it's a Konami game, once again, and Konami doesn't make games, they don't remaster games, they just sit around, basically, so, no, I'm kidding. They sometimes remaster, but they don't make new games. There was also the Saga games, which I think was, what was it, Final Fantasy, it wasn't Adventure, but it was another thing, it was like Final Fantasy something. Um, But Saga is another RPG. Final Fantasy Legend, that's what it was. Okay, so just like they did with Mana, where they didn't want to put out an RPG not under the name Final Fantasy, they did the same thing with Saga, and they put out the first Saga game under Final Fantasy Legend, even though it wasn't a Final Fantasy game, which is hilarious. So I want the Saga games on Game Boy, Switch Online. Again, I don't think they're likely, but I would love it. Another game I want on Game Boy Switch Online is Mole Mania. I'm actually a little surprised this isn't something that's on there. That seems like the kind of thing they would put on there. Mole Mania was the game directed by Miyamoto, and it's got like underground dungeons, and I guess it's actually a lot like Zelda, but you play as a mole. And it was like basically all him making the game. Of course, Miyamoto, has carried Nintendo forever, but Mole Mania is like his, pride and joy, his little, his own little game. I mean, sure, it was like Mario, right? But Bowl Mania is a more recent thing, slightly. It's not very recent, but it's more recent. And so it's kind of cool, a game, and I think I'd like it on Switch Online, and apparently it's one of the best on Game Boy, so I want to see that for myself. I also put on here the first Wario Land and the second Wario Land. Of course, the first Wario Land being titled Super Mario Land 3 Wario Land. Or maybe it's actually backwards. Maybe it's Wario Land Super Mario World 3. Or Land 3, not World 3. Of course, they did Super Mario Land on Game Boy as the 2D Mario game, and then they did Super Mario Land 2, the 6 golden coins, and then they made Wario Land, Super Mario Land 3, and then when they made Wario Land 2, they dropped the Super Mario Land branding. So, we've got Wario Land 3 on Game Boy, we've got Wario Land 4 on Game Boy Advance, so what the heck, why not Wario Land 1 and 2? What did Wario Land 1 and 2 do to you, Nintendo? Come on, people. Alright, I've also put here on Game Boy a pretty obvious one that I'm sure a lot of people would be happy about. The Pokemon games. Let's get, Red and Blue or Yellow or whatever you want to put out, and like Crystal and the other one. I'm not much of a Pokemon guy, I'm sure you can tell. What is it? Gold and Silver and Crystal, I think was what it was. So put those out, why not, right? Because they're old RPGs, Obviously, Nintendo doesn't directly own them, but of course, I'm sure Nintendo, if they wanted to, they could get those things out. The problem is that I'm sure there's a chance of them getting remade and stuff, and then they might not come out. But, personally, I'm not a big Pokemon guy, but I'd be interested in at least in the old Pokemons. So I'd definitely play that if they put that out. Alright, next up we've got the Game Boy Advance. This is another one that I kind of couldn't think of a ton of stuff, but I managed to get a few little things. My first one for Game Boy Advance was Super Monkey Ball Jr. So, of course, this is about the time of Super Monkey Ball on the GameCube. I want to play Super Monkey Ball on the GameCube. the few of them that are out. There's a few of them on GameCube. I want to play those. There are remakes now on Switch, so maybe I'll grab one of those at some point. Um, but yeah, Super Monkey Ball came to Game Boy Advance too, and I think something like Super Monkey Ball on a handheld would be kind of neat. So I want Super Monkey Ball Jr. This is another, this is a Sega game, right? Of course, Monkey Ball is a Sega game. I think a lot of people know that. Um, but Sega kept making games on Nintendo platforms there at the end of the Genesis, at the sorry, not Genesis, the end of the Dreamcast generation, because the Dreamcast did so abysmally that they started just porting over everything they could, from Dreamcast to GameCube and to PS2 and sometimes to Xbox as well. Um, and of course, on handhelds, they were making all their handheld games on Nintendo because the Game Gear was long gone at that point. So it's kind of cool to have Sega games, on Nintendo consoles. Obviously, since then there's been tons. But I think it'd be cool to have a Sega game on the Switch Online service along with the Genesis collection. Like, it's just kind of weird. I also put on here Mario versus Donkey Kong. Having started Donkey Kong 94 now, I'm like a world in. I'm like, wow, this is really good. And Mario versus Donkey Kong is supposed to be like, this the remake, or sorry, the sequel to that. Of course, Mario versus Donkey Kong, another thing that's unlikely because they remade it. They just remade it like last year, right at the start of the year. I think it was February. Maybe no, it was January. I think it was in January. They put out the Mario versus Donkey Kong remake, so I don't see any way this comes, but I think it would be cool if it did, because why not, right? It's one of those things that I think would be really well-fitting on Switch Online if they hadn't remade it. This isn't like a game I want, but they've got the Starfy games on Game Boy Advance, but they haven't translated them. They're just tossed out in Japanese. And yes, they're 2D platformers, but I guess there's a lot of text, and you have to, like, listen, like, to the people in the game to know where to go and what to do. So they're, like, really difficult and hard to play, if you don't speak Japanese, which I happen to not, konnichiwa, right? I happen to not speak Japanese, so I would like them to translate the Starfy games. I don't think it's that hard. I mean, if they just didn't put them out on the Switch Online service, I would understand. But for some reason, they put them out, just not translated. So, I want them to translate Starfy. I also wrote down Mario Tennis Power Tour, which is funny because it actually looks like Wario Tennis where I wrote it, so that tells you how bad my handwriting is. But yes, Mario Tennis Power Tour. I also put on here Mario Golf Advance Tour. These are the Mario Golf and Mario Tennis games from the Game Boy Advance. We've got most of the other golf and tennis games, so why do we not have the Game Boy Advance ones? Supposedly those are some of the best ones. They've got the RPG modes and stuff. So if we've got the Game Boy ones, if we've got the 64 ones, why don't we have the Game Boy Advance ones? That seems weird. I also put on here the Pokemon games again. I know there was Fire Red and Leaf Green. And I forget, what was the other... Was it Ruby and Sapphire? Yes, Ruby and Sapphire. So those could come out on Game Boy Advance. Again, I don't think the Pokemon games are likely because they'll remake them and stuff. But if they came, I'd be thrilled. Because I would definitely like to play the Pokemon games up through like the DS era. After that, maybe some of them, but I want to play the old ones for sure. And then on Game Boy Advance, the last thing I put was Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. Because again, I want all the Castlevania games. Alright, so that's all the stuff for those Nintendo systems that are on Game Boy Advance. Or, not that are on Game Boy Advance, that are on Switch Online. I guess I didn't make a Genesis list. That's kind of weird. I thought I did. I must not have made a Genesis list. Well, oh well. For Genesis, I personally don't have a ton of things I want to see next on Genesis. I mean, you could put out some of those licensed games that came into both platforms, but I'm not really sure why you would. I think Sonic Spinball's on there. That was one that I wanted. Maybe Sonic 3D Blast, but that might even be on there. I'm not sure. And then I guess you could put out the other Castlevanias that didn't come to Super Nintendo. You could put them out on there. And now we'll get into some Switch Online apps that don't actually exist that I want to see on the Switch too. Of course, we've got the libraries for NES, for Super Nintendo, for Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, 64, and Genesis. But, why can't, on the Switch 2, we have a DS library, right? Of course, people have been talking specifically about GameCube, I think is kind of the one people want more. People have been talking about that for ages. I think probably since the Wii U came out. People have been saying, "Oh, we need GameCube Switch Online," or well, they weren't saying Switch Online. They're like, "Oh, we need GameCube Virtual Console," right? And then I think that really picked up, especially like when the Switch came out. People were like, "Yeah, we need the GameCube Switch Online app," you know? Even before we had a 64 Switch Online app, everybody was like, "Yeah, we need 64 and GameCube." And I was always in the camp that GameCube wasn't happening. Even now, I'm not totally convinced that it's happening on Switch 2, but I never for a second thought that it could possibly happen on Switch. It felt too recent. Now I think we're at the point where it's definitely possible on Switch 2. Definitely possible. I wouldn't quite go as far as likely. Um, I think DS games are likely, though. I think DS games are likely. I think GameCube games are moderately likely. I mean, I could see either way. Almost like a coin flip. I think by next generation, we will have some sort of online app for GameCube games. By the end of next generation, I should say. So, like, in 8 years' time, there will be some way to play. By 8 years from now, there will be a way to play GameCube games. I'm pretty sure. But who knows? You know, I obviously I'm not like a genius. As much as I like to think I am. Um, but anyway, so let's get on with it though. We've got, after the ones that we've already got, I've made a DS wish list as well. This one's a little longer, I think. On DS, I put the Pokemon games. So on DS, there was what, X and Y, and Diamond and Pearl, and Black and White. I know those aren't in order, but I think those are all three on DS. Um, is that right? Or is there more? I don't know. That was fine. Whatever. It doesn't matter. Everybody knows I'm not a big Pokemon guy. I don't know much. But there were those ones on DS. Those ones, again, could potentially come to Switch Online. Again, I don't think those are likely. In fact, they're probably even less likely than the originals. But they're not likely, for sure. But doesn't mean I don't want to see them. All right, the second thing I put on here was Super Mario 64 DS. I think if we did get a DS Switch Online app, this would be a given. Of course, we would have Super Mario 64 DS. Personally, I'm not a crazy big fan of Super Mario 64 DS, but, I do think that it on the Switch would be better, and of course, we would have it on the Switch. The next one's maybe a bit less of a given, but I'd like to see it. Rhythm Heaven. Rhythm Heaven is a series that a lot of people are very sad that it has kind of died off recently. And I agree, it's kind of a weird thing that, you'd think they would be making those still, but they're not anymore. Of course, Rhythm Heaven is possibly one of the most famous rhythm games out there. I mean, you got like Rock Band, you got Guitar Hero, you've got Dance Dance Revolution, but I think Rhythm Heaven's definitely up there, right? Um, I guess nowadays you got things like Beat Saber, in VR. You got mobile stuff. You got those piano tile games. Um, so I guess it's a little different, but I do think Rhythm Heaven is still quite well known and quite popular. I also put Castlevania: Portrait of Ruin, Order of Ecclesia, I don't know, and Dawn of Sorrow. I think that's all of them. I think there are only 3 on DS. Those are the ones I could find. Um, I wasn't aware of any more, but I could have just not ever heard about them. And again, this is just because I want all the Castlevanias, because I want to play them all. I don't think these are likely. Next up, I put Kirby Mass Attack, which is like, I think you could play it multiplayer, but it's almost like The Amazing Mirror, if I'm correct on that, where there's like multiple characters that are all fighting a big boss together. Of course, Amazing Mirror also has levels and stuff, but it's a little different. But Mass Attack, Kirby Mass Attack, I've been playing through all the old Kirbys. I've played every Kirby up through, I guess, Crystal Shards is the newest one I've played. And I'm working on Amazing Mirror, and then I don't have the ones after that, so then I'll probably jump around a little bit. I'm hoping Planet Robobot is remastered like everybody was expecting it to be, and I want to play Forgotten Land, and I want to play Kirby Epic Yarn is another one I want to play. I put on this list as well 999. I really don't know much about 999 other than it's like a visual novel. But I just wanted to put it up here because it's one of those things that I want to play eventually. I think there were a couple other games in that series too, and I can't remember what they're called. Shoot, I don't know actually. Actually, no, I totally do. What was that one? I think there's 3 games, but what was the other one that I do know about? It was on this Nintendo Life podcast. I don't know, man. Anyways, there's more of those. But I put 999 on here. I think it's probably the most popular. I also put Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. Ace Attorney. I definitely want to play some of these visual novels. The only visual novel I've played is The Murder of Sonic the Hedgehog, which, by the way, that game's awesome. It's also free on Steam. Everybody should play The Murder of Sonic the Hedgehog. But I do want to get into visual novels properly, so I want to play Phoenix Wright. Maybe like Danganronpa, I don't know. But definitely Phoenix Wright is the big one for me. And also Professor Layton. So I put on here as well Professor Layton, The Curious Village, and The Last Spectre. Both of them. Also on the list, I put The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass. I would hope that they would add like some sort of button controls, but I don't know. Knowing them, they might not. I actually would probably prefer a full-on remake of Phantom Hourglass, but if it's just a Switch Online thing, that's okay as well. But I don't think it'll happen because they would have to redo the controls and stuff for it to work well. There's also Spirit Tracks on DS, so I put that on here as well. I put Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, which I was under the impression that Shadow Dragon. So Shadow the Dragon is a remake of the first Fire Emblem. I was under the impression that Shadow Dragon only came out in Japan, but I think I'm wrong on that from looking it up. I think it's actually out over here as well, but I don't know. If it's only in Japan, then localize it. If not, just put it out. I put Chrono Trigger here too. I figured if we can't get it on Super Nintendo, maybe we can get the DS version. Either way, fine by me. I just want the game. I also put Elite Beat Agents. It's another rhythm game that's pretty popular from DS. I don't think it's quite as popular as Rhythm Heaven, but it's another one that you hear going around a little bit. I put on here Animal Crossing Wild World. Personally, I am not the biggest fan of Wild World as far as an Animal Crossing game, but it's still an Animal Crossing game. It's still pretty darn good. So if we got that, I would probably still play it because it's better than New Horizons and it's on Switch, so I'd probably play it a little bit. I also put on here New Super Mario Brothers. I think that's kind of a given. If we do get a DS Switch Online, of course we're gonna get Super Mario Brothers or New Super Mario Brothers. That's why wouldn't we, right? And I also put on here Mario and Luigi Partners in Time, and then Bowser's Inside Story. And I do actually think that those would happen because they put um, Superstar Saga on Game Boy Advance Switch Online. So if they put that on Switch Online, then you would think they would do the same for Partners in Time and Bowser's Inside Story. But you never know. And then also Mario Kart DS, that's probably a given. That would be really nice for mission mode and stuff, to have it on Switch. Though I'm probably going to end up playing it before that happens anyways. And then I put on here The World Ends With You, which is, I think it's an RPG. It's a Square Enix thing. A lot of people talk about it like it's really good. So I was like, alright, sounds good. But again, this isn't something that I expect to come. These are just things that I would wish to come. Alright, now let's get to the big one, probably the biggest one, and that is GameCube Switch Online. So I've picked out some games. I probably could have come up with more, but I just picked out some ones. And honestly, not all of these would come, even if we did get a GameCube Switch Online, so it's okay. The first thing I put on here was Wind Waker. We need Wind Waker. We need, the Wind Waker remaster. But honestly, I'd even take the GameCube version of Wind Waker. Just put Wind Waker on Switch 2 somehow. I also put on here Twilight Princess. That one, honestly, I would probably not be the most pleased with just a Switch Online port, but I'd still be kind of happy. I think I'd prefer, though, if they just, remaster that. Also, we've got Mario Kart Double Dash. Of course, that's a given. That would come. That's the only Mario Kart that I can't play. I have all the other ones, either on Switch Online or on the cart. So that would be kind of cool to now be able to play them all. That would be great. Also, I put Super Mario Sunshine. This is a given, I think all the ones I've said so far are very likely. The only one I could see them not doing Twilight Princess, because it was more of a Wii game, but I don't know. I still think they probably would. Then there's Melee. Again, Melee, I actually think they might not do since they haven't done Smash 64, and they would probably be worried about, the competitive scene and stuff with that. But I would definitely like for them to do it because I'd like to be able to play Melee. I probably wouldn't play it much. I'd probably just check it out or something, but it'd be an interesting thing for sure. I put on here Animal Crossing on GameCube. Honestly, this is dangerous. If they put Animal Crossing GameCube out on Switch Online, I might play it a little too much. I think I would get quite hooked on that. So, because playing it on GameCube is awesome, and I did play a little on Dolphin. I had the game though, but I played it a little bit on Dolphin for YouTube Let's Play, and that was awesome too. And man, that game is great. I think I do maybe prefer City Folk still, but it's definitely the second best for me. I put on here Star Fox Adventures and Star Fox Assault. I know people don't like those games, but I think they probably still deserve to be here, and I'd still like to play them. I've heard that if you're not a crazy big Star Fox fan, they might actually be pretty good. Also, Kirby's Air Ride. I don't think Kirby's Air Ride is particularly likely. It's fairly niche, but and to be fair, there are a lot of the other things on here. But Kirby's Air Ride I think would be kind of cool. I'd check out Kirby's Air Ride. I think there's like some levels, so I'd probably do the story for that. Um, I put on here Metroid Prime 1, 2, 3. I do think we're gonna get 2 and 3 Metroid Prime at some point. I don't know when. I do think we're gonna get those in some capacity on Switch 2. Probably in like a remastered form. But I think they could put them out here on GameCube as well. Maybe it would eat their sales a little bit, so maybe they'd want to wait a couple years or something. But I think, to have a GameCube Switch Online and not have those games would be a little bit blasphemous, even if they have remasters. Then I also put on Fire Emblem Path of Radiance because I want to play some Fire Emblem games. And also the big thing is that this game is like ridiculously expensive. I mean, so are like most of these GameCube games, but this game is like even more so. So I think it'd be really nice to have this game. You don't have to buy it for $100 or whatever. I think it's actually more. I think it's a couple hundred. I put on here Soul Calibur 2. The only reason I put this here, I mean, it's a fighting game. I'd like to check it out. Also, because Link's playable. That's really why I put it here, because that's pretty cool. I put the Thousand Year Door on here because it's a GameCube game, but that's very unlikely because they remastered it. Or remade it, really, I'd say. But it's on here anyways, Thousand Year Door, one of the best RPGs out there. It was number 4, I think, in my games last year. I put F-Zero GX. I think this would happen. They have F-Zero X on 64, so why not GX on GameCube? Most people agree that that's one of the best racing games of all time, which is cool. I've never played it myself, but I'd like to check it out. I've got Pikmin 1 and 2. I think these are actually likely, even though they have remasters. Because I don't think that many people bought those, and also they were like very much just ports. There was very little effort or anything put into those, and those aren't selling anyway, so I don't think it would really hurt their sales. I put Sonic Adventure 2 Battle on here. I don't think that would actually happen, and honestly, if it did, I probably wouldn't play it. I just thought it was an interesting idea. Luigi's Mansion. I think Luigi's Mansion is a given. I think you have to have Luigi's Mansion. I mean, it was literally a launch game, right? Or I think it was like mainly kind of the only launch game. Um, they put out that stupid remake on 3DS. I mean, I guess the remake's pretty decent, but like they put it out after Switch came out, and everybody was upset. I'm one of those people that's upset about it. But to be honest, it makes sense because of the 3D stuff. But it was too late for that. They should have done that earlier on in the generation if they were going to do that. Then I put on here Rogue Squadron 2. I had Rogue Squadron on 64. So let's get Rogue Squadron 2 on GameCube. Again, not likely because it's a Star Wars game. I keep saying that after every game. It's not likely. Like, obviously it's not likely. But it's just cool. Then I put on here Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem. That is the, like, weird little horror game that Nintendo published on GameCube. I don't know the full story behind that. You can look into it yourself if you'd like. But that would be a cool thing. I've heard it's actually really good, and also it's funny that Nintendo published something like that. I put on here Four Swords Adventures, even though I'd probably never get to play it with friends, because I don't have friends. At least not people that play old games and stuff. I have friends, just that they don't play they don't play old games, and I don't think I could drag people with. There's not enough people with Switches and people with the online service and stuff. Imagine trying to wrangle the people together to play Four Swords Adventures. I don't know. That'd be crazy. Beyond Good and Evil is another one that I've heard good things. I know like basically nothing about this game, but I've heard good things, so I think it'd be cool to have it. I put Skies of Arcadia. It's like an RPG, I believe. I actually forgot what that is. I put it on here and I can't remember what that is. Beautiful Joe. Beautiful Joe is like maybe the only 2D platformer. I'm sure there's maybe more, but it's the only well-known 2D platformer on GameCube. You don't tend to see a ton of those. They were in the 3D era. But apparently Beautiful Joe is really good, and it's also a 2D platformer on GameCube, and it looks amazing. So I think it would be a cool thing to have. I don't actually know who made that either, Beautiful Joe. And then I also put on here Resident Evil 4. I think that's very unlikely, but, I figured maybe I'd just humor it, right? Oh, it was Capcom. Okay, it's Capcom. It was, I know Resident Evil was. I was looking up Beautiful Joe. Yeah, Beautiful Joe was Capcom as well. That's cool. Maybe there's actually possibility of a remake then, if it was Capcom. It's probably not likely, but it's possible. And then that was all I had for GameCube. So the rest of these things, pretty minor stuff. I've just put down some. I don't actually have any games for them. I just wrote down some libraries that I think we could see. I've got Game Gear games. We could have GameCube games. If we have Genesis games, we could have Game Gear games. I think the only problem I could see arising with this is that a lot of the Game Gear games are just Genesis games. But there's definitely a few out there that aren't, and they could put the Game Gear versions of a few of those games on there. And even if the library comes out and it's only like 10 games, I think that's fine. I don't think you need a ton. Sega Saturn games would be really cool. You could make an argument that they're a little bit too new, but I mean it's like 64 games. I don't think that's too new. Like PlayStation obviously isn't happening, right? Because there's a PlayStation for that, right? But something like Sega Saturn, where they're out of the business anyways, or at least they're out of the console business, I think that's quite possible. Sega hasn't, or they've remastered like quite a few of those things, like Shenmue, and I guess Shenmue was Dreamcast though, right? Anyway, they like Panzer Dragoon and that kind of stuff. But they could put out the originals on Switch Online. I don't think it would actually. I don't think it would hurt them. I put on here CDI because that's funny, right? Imagine Hotel Mario on Switch 2, or the Zelda games. I can't remember what they're actually called, but imagine those on Switch 2. That would be amazing. I put on here Dreamcast as well. Dreamcast feels a little new. I know it's obviously still older than GameCube. It's the same generation, but it feels too new for a non-first party thing. But it'd be, you could still have it. And of course, if Dreamcast came, like Shenmue and stuff, and then also like Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, I would want on Dreamcast instead of on GameCube. Actually, maybe I'd want both, or maybe I'd want GameCube. I don't know. But I could see them putting out on either. Sega GT, right? Let's get some Sega GT in here. I think that'd be a cool thing. And then I put some other things all with question marks. I've got Atari. Specifically, I was thinking the 2600, maybe the 5200, maybe even like 7800. I mean, they could just do like a library of all of those, to be honest. Then they could do like an Atari Lynx library, right? Atari Jaguar library. Those would all be cool things because these are games that aren't very accessible. And Atari is in a weird spot as a company. I think they could really benefit from getting some deal to put those games out. They're not capable of putting all those things out, and they don't have the audience to get those things out. So I think putting them out on Switch Online would be pretty cool. And then they could get some partnership where whenever they put out a new version, like they put out like the Yars Metroidvania, and they put out other stuff like that. If they put out more new versions of their old games, they could totally put them out on Nintendo platforms, and they could become a Nintendo developer, right? That'd be kind of cool. Not exclusively, but I think they would. If the old Atari games were on Switch, I think that would kind of push that in that direction where maybe they are mostly on Nintendo. So that would be cool. I put Magnavox. Maybe we could get Magnavox Odyssey 2. I can't imagine we'll get Magnavox Odyssey 1, but Odyssey 2 would be interesting. I don't think it'll happen because I don't know. I mean, Magnavox, they're quite large. They're not really in the space anymore. But it'd be a cool thing for sure. And I put on here the TurboGrafx and the Neo Geo. Of course, those were both on the Wii Virtual Console, so I don't see any reason why those can't come back. I believe Nintendo actually holds the rights. Oh no, actually, okay, they own the rights to. Konami owns the rights to TurboGrafx. And is Neo Geo, or sorry, not Neo Geo, is SNK still around? Okay, that's in Saudi Arabia. So fine. I thought Nintendo owned the rights to one of those things. I guess I could be wrong. But anyways, so Neo Geo, TurboGrafx games, those were on Wii Virtual Console. So if they're on Wii Virtual Console, why can't they be on Switch? On Switch, Nintendo Switch Online. And then the last thing I put on here was Virtual Boy. I don't think we're gonna get that. But they could put out I don't know, like Mario Tennis or something. Put out that Wario game that was on there. That'd be cool. But of course, there's only a few that ever came out. But it'd be a cool thing to have for sure. And then of course, the ultimate console that we need on Switch Online Virtual Console, besides the CDI, is the Wii U. That's practically ancient history at this point. And really, I'm thinking all we need on Wii U Virtual Console is like 3 games, right? We need Nintendo Land because that game's awesome. Nintendo Land's best game of all time, right up there with Mario 64. Then we need Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival. That's even better than Mario 64. I mean, Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival, man, that game, absolute 10 out of 10. It's a banger. I mean, best game Nintendo put out in 2015 by far. Honestly, best game Nintendo has put out since then. I mean, like, there's literally never been a better Nintendo game. I guess Metroid Other M kind of, gives it a run for its money. But yeah, Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival, absolutely need that game. And then the third game, this is a game I've really wanted to play on Switch for a long time. It's something that, is stuck on Wii U. There's not many games left stuck on Wii U. It'd be really cool to play The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild on Switch. I mean, why would they ever put that? Like, they literally put it out on Wii U the same day that the Switch came out. Like, can you believe that? Like, why? Like, that's ridiculous. Why didn't they make a Switch version as well? I mean, like, freaking idiots there, Nintendo. Come on, people. Like, freaking, ugh, can you believe it? Anyways, so, with all that said, thank you all for tuning in. This is, what is this, the fourth episode, fourth week of this. Email the show. Email the show at notjustnintendo@gmail.com, NOTJUSTNINTENDO. There are links to the podcasts, Blue Sky and X.com in the description, but I haven't been posting on there, so I'm not going to read them out. It's pretty pointless. But if you want to join, you can. You can also join the Discord. The links to that is also in the description. That is not particularly active, but if you guys join, maybe it will be, right? So you can join that. That's my YouTube Discord, but of course, it can go for multiple things, All right, so with all that said, I will see you all next week. 21 days till Switch 2 presentation. Let's roll the music.